All right, so here's a scripture verse I doubt anyone has ever heard in any sermon, but we're going to start with it this morning. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, okay? There was a time when Paul was like, he was kind of on the outskirts of what he was 100% confident in, but he also felt like this is the right thing to say. And so I'm going to start with that today. And say that, some of what I say, it's mine, right? As Gina said, the question was, what is my understanding of the role of the church in society? Okay, so unlike most of us, I have yet to reach perfection, and so some of what I say might not be taken from your side as from gospel. So I asked the question, what is the role of church in society? How many of us here know that we, as a Methodist denomination, have a board of church and society? Yippee skippy, about 3 or 4 of us, right? So it's important enough to the denomination to have a board that oversees that, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about that, what their work is in a few minutes. Now, while I didn't receive many responses to the question of how has the church shaped you, I received far less on this question, as in one. And the one person said, it's a hard question. And so I was trying to figure out, and really I struggled and wasn't able to figure out why it's a hard question, because I suspect everyone has an opinion. We heard Gina's, but I think we all have some idea in our own thinking, and maybe you were worried that it wouldn't agree with my thinking, or that it wouldn't be loquacious enough to sound like something, but it surprised me because I thought that there would be, more of a response. But as I know, we all have an opinion on it. So I want to start where Julie Andrews started when she said, "Well, let's start at the very beginning." So I'm going to go back. We're going to go in the Wayback Machine to talk about how people of faith respond to the outer world. Okay. So the history of the Jewish people was to welcome the stranger. Now, if you heard Mike Johnson's understanding of welcoming the stranger this week, you heard, in my opinion, not a good explanation of how to welcome the stranger. Okay, and most of you probably didn't hear that, but it was interesting, to say the least. His point was that you don't assimilate. When you come in, you are to assimilate into the culture, not be different from the culture. But the history of the United States is one of assimilation, right? We are all here, and we bring our own uniqueness into this nation. But I want to go back again, as I said, to the Jewish people welcoming the stranger. That was a part of a Middle Eastern custom called Pashtuli Code of Honor. How many of us watched Lone Survivor? It was put out in 2013. Yeah, 2013, and Mark Wahlberg was in it. And it was the story of SEAL Team 6. This is the best of the best. They went into Afghanistan, and they had a person that they were supposed to take out, and it went horribly wrong. It started with bad, their communication equipment broke down, and so they get into this fierce firefight. It looks like hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghans are coming towards them with machine gun type guns, and so Mark Wahlberg's character is Marcus Luttrell is his name, is the only one to survive, and it's a real heart beater or a heart stopper, depending on what your heart does in those situations. So he ultimately, after tumbling down this mountain, it's incredible that he somehow manages to live. He wakes up almost like face down in a pool of water, And he looks up and he sees an Afghan gentleman with a rifle, I believe. But this man takes him in because of this Pashtuli code of honor, because the Pashtuli code of honor says that when you meet a stranger, you are to be hospitable to them. You are to give them asylum. So the Pashtuli code of honor talks about justice and bravery, and the Jewish understanding of welcoming the stranger is consistent with what was in general that whole Middle Eastern understanding of welcoming the stranger. So that's the background then for when we move into the time of Jesus. And what we see in the time of Jesus, what we see then is how one another cared for each other in the early church based upon the words of Jesus, which we just read collectively together. But they had also experienced Jesus' own actions, right? He fed people. He took a little bit of food and he miraculously, or somehow it worked out that this entire group of people were fed. He watched them touch people, heal their blindness. He watched them, they watched him touch lepers. And so Jesus lived a life of connecting with people who society, as a rule, had pushed away. Jesus healed people, mind, body, and soul. The history then of the early church, as they thought about the words of Jesus, as they thought about the way Jesus lived his life, was this very engaging response, which we see from Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. All who believed, that's the community of faith, right? All who believed were together and they had all things in common. They'd sell their possessions and their goods, and they distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Okay, so this is where Arnie says, all right, let's pass the plate right now, you know. They shared their possessions. So remember, what we're talking about today is how does the church interact with society? They shared their possessions. They sold their property. In fact, there's a story in the book of Acts where somebody held out and lied about some property. And when confronted with that, the two of them dropped dead. You know, take that for what it's worth. That's another, like, take the offering right after you tell that story. The offering might go up, you know. And then the outcome of that passage, you don't need to put it back up. The outcome of that passage, where they shared their possessions, they sold their property, and they distributed them amongst them, the next verses read then that day by day, they were together. They were together in the temple. They were together in their homes. They eat and they shared their food with one another with glad and generous hearts. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. People looked at the church in that giving arena, and they said, wow, I want to be a part of that. I want to, they have what I want in my life. And it wasn't material things. They watched the spirit. They watched the love. They watched the intentionality. They watched the generosity of that group and said, wow, something has happened in their life. Okay, so then in Acts chapter 6, we read that the people noticed and complained that the widows and orphans were in need. And so there was still more need to be taken care of. And so what was the response of the church? Again, you can read about this in Acts chapter 6. It said they organized in such a way. So the early church was organized. They organized in such a way to address that need. They said, we've got widows here, we've got orphans here, we have people in need, and that need was being brought to them. And so in response then, the church said, well, let's get organized. Let's make sure that no one slips between the cracks. Well, did they set up a food bank? Well, no. Because remember, at this point in history, they were still underground. You know, they were marked people. And so they did this kind of under the cover of darkness, you might say. So that's in the what? We'll call that in the hundreds, you know, somewhere in the 60 to the hundreds after. So I want to just give us a little history here. So then as the church then became the church and became the accepted organization within the book of Rome, within the country of Rome, you know, then things eventually really went sideways, right? The church has, hopefully, I think all of us are aware, the church has a very checkered history. And when we say that, we might think of, oh yeah, man, like the Crusades. Now there's some checkered history, right? Where you bend the knee to us, you accept the faith as we have it, or else we will literally kill you for Christ. And then we have the doctrine of discovery. What's the doctrine of discovery? If you remember, when you see people, you know, coming onto a new land or they're coming into America, in every picture there would be a priest, you know, holding a cross, you know, on a stick. And why was that? Was because when they planted that stick on the ground, they claimed it in the name of the church for their country. And so you saw it down in all of the Central American countries, you saw it in the South American countries. So the church, it was the church that emboldened our taking over and creating so much genocide in the world. It was the church. So often the church has not been on the side of making the world a better place. Those were dark times. So then we come to the 1700s, okay? Some of us are aware of that time. 1700s, we have John Wesley. John Wesley, when you want to think about how long John Wesley lived, just basically think the 1700s. He came in about 1703 or 4, I can't remember what, and lived about 1790. John Wesley and his brother Charles would become the birth pangs of what we would call the Methodist Church. So what were some of the things that John Wesley was interested in? Holiness, right? Holiness of heart, holiness of life, holiness of community. And Wesley had this fantastic ability to hold those two, or really three, in tension. And churches, in my experience, have always struggled. They've either been on one side of the equation or on the other side of the equation. Wesley held both of those. Wesley firmly believed in a holiness of life that would encompass some of what Gina talked about, where I'm going to treat Rob in a generous and a loving way, and I'm going to do whatever I can to help make his life better. But then on the outer part, it's Wesley firmly believed. He worked the halls of what we would call their Congress, Parliament over there, worked the halls over there. When he wasn't preaching 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, working for the abolition of slavery. Historians who have no interest in the religious world will credit Wesley with helping end slavery in England. He worked for prison reform and debtors' rights. So people who, if you got behind on your payment, they would throw you in jail. Right? Now that made a lot of sense, right? I mean, no. But that's what they did. So he worked on that. He worked on child labor laws. That was the age of the weaving loom, right? And little kids were great because their fingers were small, and so they could get in there and work some of those weaving looms. The only trouble was a lot of times they lost their fingers. And so Wesley worked on getting laws passed through Parliament that took away the right for those children to be able to work in dangerous situations. He worked on education for the poor. He was the one that started Sunday schools. But for them, it literally was reading, writing, and arithmetic, because they weren't getting good schooling out in the public. He started working with Sunday schools. Healthcare. He actually wrote a book on like herbal medicine, you might say. He was a leader, a thought leader in terms of how to take care of people's bodies as well. So I got a little screenshot here, guys. So one of it was distilled this way. So slavery was the issue. The people in power said, well, that's essential to British economy. And Wesley said, it's a moral outrage. Wealth, as is typical throughout the Older Testament, was a sign of God's blessing. Wesley said, no, it's a dangerous snare. You must be aware that wealth can corrupt. And then in terms of prisoners, at that time, and still often to this day, the British mentality was that they were the scum of society. They were put away. They were forgotten. But Wesley was adamant that no, these are human beings created in the image of God. So it goes without saying that Wesley walked and talked out of both sides of his mouth. He talked personal holiness. He lived personal holiness. He talked social holiness, and he terrifically engaged in social holiness. One of the more interesting and powerful, for those of us who have studied the life of John Wesley, one of his more and more powerful statements is this one. The gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, and no holiness but social holiness. That is so important in my formation in terms of my understanding of the church as it relates to society. No holiness but social holiness. Our historical roots as a denomination come from that statement. Now, have we, as a church here in America, failed? Oh, holy yes. Have we? It was the church that enabled slavery in this country, 100%. We were the leading voice in keeping the gay and lesbian community closeted. My Wednesday night group, we've read several books on this topic. There was a large Methodist church. I don't know, any of you guys remember what city it was. There was a large Methodist church that after church, they went and had a picnic and watched a lynching. That's our heritage. Okay, so the church has a checkered past, to say the least. We knew redlining was going on. The church, organized religion, has a long and storied history of not wanting to speak up against the social ills of society. Why? Because they were afraid they might lose, or were sure they would lose money, right? Still goes true today, follow the money, right? See, when I was growing up, and some of us are about that same age, we thought everything was pretty good here in the old US of A, right? We didn't know about all of the pain and the suffering that our sisters and brothers were going through. For the most part, we thought everything was pretty good. And not just for us, but we thought everyone was kind of getting along. And so to whatever extent we felt the need to become better people, we worked on that. And our social outreach, well, as my memory serves me, the social outreach tended to be, well, let's help the starving people in Africa. And let's help the starving people over in Egypt. Because we thought everything was good here. Honestly, I think for the most part, we thought it was good here. And it wasn't as though we were turning a blind eye, but I'm sure many were. We simply were turning an eye towards we thought the need was most pressing. So to the degree that we worked with personal holiness within our lives, our social expression of that was somewhere over there. Because over here was okay, you know. But now our eyes have become collectively opened. Gina referenced one of the most clear-eyed openings. So out of the Methodist Church, then the United Methodist Church, and out of the church, certainly the Board of Church and Society, we have this little book. And you might think it's got large print in it, but it does not. The title of this book is the Book of Resolutions of the United Methodist Church. I'm just going to, guidelines on the imposition of sanctions, rights of workers, enabling financial support for domestic programs, eradication of sexism, affirmation of the United Methodist Women, Native American history and culture, support for the Coalition of Reproductive Choice, concerns about genetic science, child soldiers, aging, and the church's response. So we are a church that feels that we have a moral obligation to help frame society, that no one is better at saying this is what we need to be doing than the church. Contained in that book, although that book's 2012, is this shorter reading, which is the social principles of the United Methodist Church. It talks about the economic community, the social community, the political community. And then it has our social creed in there, which I should have us reading every once in a while. But some would say, well, wait a minute, Pastor. What about the separation of church and state? How many of us know that's in the Constitution? Yeah, well, you'd all be wrong. It's not, okay? Where did we get that notion? We get that notion from what is truly called the Establishment Clause, okay? So here's the Establishment Clause. And don't worry, I would have been wrong too. Congress, Article 1, right? Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion. We have simply taken that phrase and simply simplified it to say separation of church and state. But it's not. It says Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion. We hear that all the time. What's the First Amendment? Separation of church and state, right? We do that. Well, why wasn't Article number 1 for the good folks gathering in the East? Because they had just come from a country where the government and the church were tight as ticks, as they say, right? They had come from a country where the church was called the Church of England. Yes, ding, ding, ding. We all got that one, right? Yes, it was the Church of England. So they didn't want the church in the government. They wanted to separate those two, and they didn't want the government to be running the church because the power to tax is the power to diminish. So I understand that some people would say, well, keep the church and the state separate. But what is called politics out of the church, but as I see it, it's not any significant societal issue that's not politicized. I can't read my own notes here. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, if we say, what are the human needs that we have in our culture right now, they've all been politicized. I can't think of one that hasn't. So if we as a church want to work for the betterment of society and address the social ills of our times, I don't see how it cannot be called political. So do you think that the church is called to make the world a better place? That's kind of the basic question, I feel. And how do we do that? Well, we have our individual piety, which Gina addressed. But if we're going to stand with the immigrant community, if we're going to stand with them, it's going to be political. If we're going to take a stand on women's right to choice, it's political. When we bring light to the horrific inequality, and I think we've got a screenshot here. I think many of us have heard of this one. The top 1% of all households have 33% of all of the wealth in America, while the bottom 50% hold 2.5%. So if we're going to speak out against that, it's political, right? Because you're going to say, well, I think some of that 1%, I don't think any individual needs to have $400 billion, okay? And another guy right behind him that has about $300 billion and says, well, gee, I can't afford to pay my reporters, so I'm going to devastate one of the few remaining national newspapers. So if we're going to work for those things, it's going to sound political. It's going to be political. We have no choice. If you're going to try to make it safe for people of color to vote, it's going to be political. If you're going to speak out against the defunding of USAID, that they're quite sure by that program being defunded has killed at least tens of thousands, if not more. Or if you're going to speak out about cancer research being defunded, meals for kids in schools being diminished, or the most recent one, 20 hours a week of community service time to get food stamps, which to me is just like so crazy, because how can they get out and get a job if they have to spend 20 hours a week, doing community work? I expect at some point the churches, this church, we will start to get inundated with people saying, can I come? I'm like, I have a hard time now. I mean, I have people wash and clean windows because and that because a judge has ordered them, so to get their SNAP benefits, in case everyone wasn't aware of that. To get their SNAP benefits, what we used to call food stamps, now you have to work 20 hours a week to do that. Or if you want to speak out against the unprecedented grifting that's taking place in the current administration, or Customs and Border Patrol dressing like they're in Fallujah while masked to intimidate, it's going to be, you have to walk the halls of Congress much like Wesley walked the halls of Parliament. I mean, that's the DNA of our church, okay? Maybe we didn't all know that. This I thought was a very interesting statistic. This one is a surprise to me, that's for sure. 70% of those receiving Medicaid or SNAP benefits, okay? 7 out of 10 people receiving Medicaid or food stamps have full-time jobs. Let that sink in. So what's that say about the place where wages are in America right now? And that came out of the government. That's a government report, okay? 7 out of 10 receiving Medicaid or food stamps, SNAP benefits have full-time jobs. That I had to make sure that was spot on because it's remarkable. So it's fair to say, well, there are organizations out there. We have Indivisible. That's Sue Rose here. God bless you. Good to see you, Sue. We have Indivisible. They meet here. I couldn't be happier that. Why not just be a part of them and leave that out of the church? Well, as I pointed out, that's our roots, okay? That's our roots, to be walking the halls of Parliament. And secondly, and I would even say more importantly, is there's no better moral compass for our society than the church. Why? Because we believe the words of Jesus when he said that this is what's important, that all nations are going to be gathered around before him. And at one point he's going to say, those of you on my right, you did what was right. You did what I asked. You fed people, you clothed people, you looked out for them. On the left, that's the uh-oh group, right? I know, Jesus said, that you've assimilated my message when you do these things. This is how you know. This is how I know that you've not only heard my message, is when you live my message. You took the hungry and you fed them. You took the thirsty and you gave them drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. And as we read, the righteous are going to say, I didn't even know I did it. Why? Because you're so busy doing it, I didn't even realize that I was doing it. He says, oh yeah, you were doing it to me. Because when you do it to the least of these, my children, you have done it unto me. Boy, there's so much more I wanted to say, but, it's only got one day. Because my own personal evolution, has come, and I can point to people in my life who were so instrumental in helping me see. Because I grew up in the everything was okay world, and so it was hard for me, and I was all into talking out of one side of my mouth, the personal holiness, but thankfully, I came to a point where people helped me understand that it's just not personal holiness that Jesus asks us. It's about caring for those out and beyond, and that there's no real way that today, it'd be nice if we could somehow theoretically separate out the politics and all that stuff. But in today's world, if we're going to help the gay community not lose some of its rights, or if we're going to help walk in solidarity with those, who are afraid to go to work, and so now they're losing their income, and so now they're worried about losing their home because of who's walking the streets out there. It's going to be political. So, the birth of the church, how the church has impacted us as individuals, and how the church moves out into the community. Lord, as Gina said, it's big and it can feel overwhelming, but we have places that we can partner with, and we can partner with our church. We have a long history of speaking for what's right, and we also have a history of being afraid to speak as well. We have wonderful groups that are organizing to make a difference. And Lord, I'm going to go home. I want to be on that right side, the side that was surprised. I said, I didn't realize I was doing all those things for you, Lord. That's when I will know, and that's when each of us will know that we've got it in our, yes, Jesus, we get it. We want to make a difference in the world. And we're going to do it because you made a difference in our life. So bless us as we make this journey together. In the name of the Christ we pray. Amen.